So, I'd like to welcome Dr. Pramod Kumar Pandey, our chairperson, Dr. Ashok Kumar Khurana, our chairperson again, Professor Subhash Dandia, another chairperson. We also have with us chairperson Dr. Vinita Singh and all the panelists, including Professor Amitava, Dr. Pradeep, Dr. B.S. Goel, Dr. Chavla, Dr. Savleen, Dr. Subhash Dandia, Dr. Jitendra, Dr. Pradeep, Dr. Shreya, Dr. Elizabeth, and Dr. Pramod Kumar Pandey. Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
So, who will be taking care of the time? You will be taking time?
Yes, sir. There'll be a timer on the screen.
Yeah. So 1 minute prior to talk.
Yeah, it'll buzz a minute prior.
Okay.
Yes. So
there's been some
I'd like to
audio
call the
problem. I can't hear you, Zoya. There's some audio problem, I think.
There's some audio problem.
No, we can listen.
All right. So should I start with the first? I think there's some net. Should you also check?
So shall we start now?
Yes, I'd like to call our first speaker. We have Professor Subhash Dandia. All right.
Dr. Subhash has a lot of interest in amblyopia, and he's done a lot of good work in amblyopia. And there is some problem. And he'll be talking of impact of PDIG studies in amblyopia in Indian context. Is there some audio problem or it is true? I don't know. In between it gets disrupted.
There could be some network
issues. Can we start?
So my slides are visible, sir?
Yeah, they are visible.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Please go ahead.
So basically, this Pediatric Eye Disease Investigator Group is a clinical network of pediatric ophthalmologists and ophthalmologists, which was funded by National Eye Institute to conduct clinical research studies related to pediatric eye conditions. And majority of the pediatric studies are focused on evaluating the comparative effectiveness of different amblyopia treatment regimens for children and adults, and they are known as amblyopia treatment studies, and the results have dramatically changed amblyopia clinical practice pattern for many eye care providers. So basically, one of the important study was ATS5, and it was aimed to evaluate effectiveness of refractive correction in moderate amblyopia, and they concluded amblyopia resolved in 27% of the patients, and improvement of more than 2 lines was seen in 77% of the patients with refractive correction only within 15 weeks of wearing of the glasses. So what is the clinical implication of this? Basically, the clinical implication of this study is the first line of therapy in amblyopia treatment is refractive correction alone for young children, and optical treatment effects should be evaluated at a follow-up interval of 6 to 8 weeks until improvement in amblyopic eye visual acuity plateaus. So additional treatment with patching or atropine may be necessary if visual acuity improvement with spectacles alone is incomplete. So basically, children who need additional amblyopia treatment after improved visual acuity from an optical treatment will have better amblyopic eye visual acuity at the start of the next treatment phase, which can result in less treatment burden and better compliance. And some children may not need additional amblyopia treatment beyond optical corrections. So we have done a thesis at our center, and in that we found with refractive correction alone, more than 2 lines of improvement in visual acuity was seen in only 16.67% of the patients, and possible reasons for this low ratio may be because most of the patients who comes to our hospital are the poor, so cost of specs will be could be a cause. Uncooperative attitude of the children, late reporting, and stigma of wearing specs might be possible reasons. So then ATS-1 was conducted, in which aim was to compare patching versus atropine penalization for treatment of moderate amblyopia in children of 3 to 7 years of age. And they concluded both are appropriate modality for initial treatment of moderate amblyopia. And the conclusion is atropine penalization is effective alternative therapy in treatment of amblyopia. Then another study was done to compare daily atropine versus weekend atropine in treatment of moderate amblyopia, and they concluded moderate atropine produces an improvement in visual acuity, which is similar to daily atropine. Then another study was there to compare weekend atropine augmented by a plano lens with weekend atropine alone for moderate amblyopia, and they concluded augmentation of weekend atropine with a plano lens does not substantially improve visual acuity in amblyopic eye. Then another study was done to compare the patching with atropine eye drops in treatment of moderate amblyopia, and they concluded atropine and patching achieved similar results among older children with unilateral amblyopia. So what are the clinical implications of these studies? So basically clinical implication is atropine penalization has similar treatment effect as 2 and 6 hours of prescribed patching. Thus, it can be considered for as the first line amblyopia treatment for patching or for patching failure cases. Daily atropine administration is not necessary. A twice per week schedule is also effective, and there is no reason to believe that atropine needs to be administered only on week and days or days that needs to be sequential. So weekend atropine penalization has shown to be effective in treating both moderate and severe amblyopia, and reduced atropine administration frequency will likely lead to improved compliance and parental satisfaction with treatment. Then another study was done that was regarding to evaluate combined patching and atropine for residual amblyopia, and they concluded amblyopic eye visual acuity improved similarly in both groups, and it was suggestive that there is no additional benefit of combined treatment in residual amblyopia. Then ATS-13 was done, in which non-randomized prospective trial of glasses alone for strabismic and anisometropic amblyopia was done, and they concluded treatment effect was greater for strabismic amblyopia. Then augmenting atropine, this is ongoing study and the results have not been published. So what are the drawbacks of ATS? We have to keep in mind that the strict inclusion criteria hampered the study by including a limited number of patients. Methodology was strict, thereby making the results subject to many questions. Ethnic variation to treatment always remains a factor, so results cannot be generalized to other countries. Then is atropine safe in tropical countries? And compliance was not monitored objectively in PEDIC studies, therefore it makes harder to interpret the results. There is no shortcut or substitute for occlusion in amblyopia therapy. However, variability exists in number of hours prescribed to treat amblyopic patients. Then in ATS-2A and 2B, duration of patching, full-time patching was compared with 6 hours patching in severe amblyopia, and they concluded there is similar improvement in both the groups. And in ATS-2B, 2 hours patching was compared with 6 hours patching in moderate amblyopia, and they concluded there is similar improvement in both the groups. So it is noted that prescribing greater hours of patching did not seem to have a significant beneficial effect in first 4 months of the treatment, and it was also noted that hours of patching did not affect the rate of improvement, and in PEDIC study treatment was changed only if number or limited improvement occurred at 6 weeks, and individual variability might occur in response to the treatment. So what are the clinical implications? Prior to PEDIC trial, full-time occlusion was commonly recommended in treatment of amblyopia, and now the implication is full-time patching is not always required for successful treatment of amblyopia. Prescribing lesser amount of patching may promote better overall compliance with treatment, and when patching is prescribed, it is reasonable to prescribe 2 hours of daily patching for moderate amblyopia and 6 hours of patching for severe amblyopia. Some children with severe amblyopia will respond to as little as 2 hours of patching, and in young children, use an adhesive patch should be strongly considered so that peaking is less likely to occur. Initiating treatment before the patient is 5 years old will yield greater improvement and stability of visual acuity compared to those in which treatment was initiated from 7 to 17 years of age. More studies are required to assess effectiveness of patching of 2 hours daily versus 6 hours daily for severe amblyopia. There is no consensus over duration of patching. Different authors have recommended a different duration of patching, and major cause of failure is poor compliance. And recent trends are in favor of part-time patching. Then, is there any age bar to treat amblyopia, or whether amblyopia can be successfully treated in older age groups? ATS 3 was conducted, and they concluded treatment can improve visual acuity in even older children. Then recurrence of amblyopia, because majority of the recurrences they are seen in children of less than 8 years of old, they occur within 3 months after cessation of treatment. So early follow-up is critical, and patching dose should be gradually tapered rather than stopping it abruptly. Then near visual activities, ATS 6 was conducted to determine whether performing near activities while patching for amblyopia enhances improvement in visual acuity, and conclusion was performing common near activities does not improve visual outcome in treatment of amblyopia. However, there are a lot of other studies which are contrary to recommendations of ATS 6. In cases of residual amblyopia, changing the treatment modality, patching to atropine or changing atropine to patching can be considered. Then a pilot study of levodopa as a treatment for residual amblyopia, and they suggested levodopa carbidopa therapy for residual amblyopia in older children is well tolerated and may improve the visual acuity. PEDIC have shown certain treatment modalities don't work, and levodopa has been used for resistant amblyopia for years. However, the most recent study found no improvement of amblyopia through use of levodopa, and in reference to levodopa as an adjuvant therapy for treatment of amblyopia, it should persuade us that it is time to move on. 25 years of study has not produced a convincing body of data to justify its clinical use as it has been used in treatment of amblyopia. So basically, we have done a study in which we have found that it can be used as an adjuvant therapy. Then there is a lot of interest regarding effectiveness of 1 hour daily binocular games versus patching in treatment of amblyopia. However, this binocular iPad treatment was not as good as 2 hours of prescribed daily patching as per PEDIC studies. Then another study is going on in which this ATS 18 is broken into 2 arms. A non-inferiority study will compare effectiveness of 1 hour per day of binocular game with 2 hours of patching in children of 5 to 13 years, and a superiority study will compare effectiveness of 1 hour per day binocular game with 2 hours per day patching in patient of 13 to 17 years of age. Then another study is going regarding excimer laser for anisometropic amblyopia. Then if there is time, I can take 1 or 2 minutes. Or...
Actually, your time is up.
Okay, thank you. I would like to...
You can take 30 seconds to quickly sum it up.
Last.
I'm saying the session is for 1 hour and 25 minutes and we have 6 speakers. So we can have little more time, maybe 10 minutes each, and still we'll have 20 minutes for discussion.
So there are 7 speakers.
Yeah.
There are 6, I think.
So basically, I would like to...
you can take 10 minutes.
I would like to concentrate on this slide. Basically, earlier historical dogma was mainstay of amblyopia treatment was patching, and now initial treatment is optimal refractive correction, and timing of refractive correction and occlusion. Earlier it was simultaneous. Now occlusion can be prescribed subsequent to gain from optical treatment, and patching doses for moderate amblyopia and patching doses for severe amblyopia. Generally, more the better was the earlier concept. Now you start with 2 hours and can increase if it is required, and start with 6 hours in severe amblyopia, and in moderate cases 2 hours patching is effective. Atropine penalization. earlier it was used only for patching failure cases. Now it can be used as a first line treatment alternative to patching or patching failure cases. And another thing is there is a lot of interest in these games, though PEDIC studies, they don't have found any role. And the levodopa, as per recent studies, is of no use, though older studies, they have found it to be used as an adjunct therapy. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
so
Subhash.
much. Sir, would you like to introduce the speakers or should I do it?
No, you can introduce. We just
Okay.
wanted to
Also,
discussion. If there are any questions, you
Sir,
can
I
take.
think you should,
I mean,
you should
somebody
introduce
has
the
to do,
speakers. He might,
or
she
we
might
have
not
by
be
the end
knowing.
of the session.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Also, do you want the time limit to increase? We have 6
Yeah, make
more
it 10
speakers
minutes, I
to
think.
go. It was 10 minutes, sir. Do you want me to make it 12 minutes? 11 minutes?
See, we have 6 speakers, and so 10 minutes is okay. 1 minute, if somebody exceeds, is all right. I think let
Okay.
it be 10 minutes.
All right. All right.
Okay.
Okay. I'd like to.
Now,
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
our next speaker is Dr. Jitendra Jethani. He has done a lot of work in strabismus. We all know him, and he'll be talking about surgical nuances in managing concomitant strabismus. As we all know, it is a very common condition, and there are lots of areas. Of course, the time is very short, so he'll try to cover relevant aspects. Dr. Jitendra Jethani.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to thank Pandey sir for giving me this opportunity. I would be speaking on basic principles of strabismus surgery, and I will be touching upon little bit on the examination part also, because as strabismus surgeons, all of us do understand that our job in OT is made easy only if we spend a lot of time in OPD with the patient. So I think the most important and the crux of the whole strabismus surgeries that we do, the most important part is the motor examination and sensory examination. But most of the amount of deviation, prism cover test, point of neutralization, point of reversal, and ocular motility, just to know whether it is indeed a committed deviation or not, and how much is the deviation. So that is another small test that we normally do is prism offset, just to see that patient has any double vision or not. This is a very quick video to show that sometimes, we don't measure fixing right eye, fixing left eye. This is just a small video to show that the patient has right eye exotropia with hyper in primary position. We can see when we cover. Once we cover the left eye, we see that fixing right eye, the deviation is different. So fixing right eye, fixing left eye, we have to see whether primary deviation, secondary deviation, whether there's any dissociated deviation. And we have to measure the angle in various gazes to come to a conclusion that if there is any A pattern, B pattern, or if there is a small incommittancy, before taking it that it is a committed deviation, we should be very alert and very cautious regarding this. So this is mainly horizontal deviation, but you can see that fixing right eye, fixing left eye, we are measuring the deviation. When we put prism in front of left eye, it is fixing right eye, and when we put prism in front of right eye, it is fixing left eye deviation. So this is very important in my view, and so we will be covering the whole of surgical part into these major headings. What is the aim of strabismus surgery? The most important aim is that you should not be losing what you already have. So you have good ocular motility in the beginning itself. Even with strabismus, in a committed strabismus, you normally have wonderful ocular motility. You should not be losing out on the committance that patient has. First and foremost aim is to improve in primary position. Second is to improve in secondary position and increase the field of binocular vision. We should try to reduce incommittancy as much as possible, and we should try to reduce the diplopia, and we should try to increase the diplopia-free gaze positions. Basic type of surgeries would be recession and resection, and then there could be vertical recession resections, myectomies, tenotomies. Obviously, they are unpredictable for the fact that they are myectomy means you are just cutting the muscle and leaving it, so they are bound to be unpredictable. And then there is a Farden suture, which means that it is a retroequatorial myopexy. So the recession doesn't actually weaken the muscle, it just changes the growth position. This is very important because normally we tend to think that recession means weakening the muscle and resection means strengthening the muscle. So that is not there. It is just the growth position which is changed accordingly. When we are doing a horizontal muscle surgery, these are small things which we should always try to see. So first thing is fixing each eye. It is very important. If you see fixing right eye, it is 30 prisms. Fixing left eye, it is 20 prisms. It would change your surgical parameters depending on which is the dominant eye, how much you want to operate, whether you want to, keep the patient on non-dominant eye and there is an angle. So I think I am asking more questions than giving answers, but it is very important to understand that whether it is a committed deviation indeed or not, and always do a force reduction test in such cases where there's a difference between right eye, left eye fixing. You should see gaze positions and how much to correct. Now, this is a very, most of in early years of our practice, this is the most important crux and most important question. What is, how much is to be corrected? So first, to find out how much is to be corrected, what is the total amount of deviation? The total amount of deviation is both the latent and the manifest component. So if you are having a patient of intermittent exotropia, total amount of deviation. Once you have the total amount of deviation, in a rather adult patient like above 12 or 14 years of age, I do a slight overcorrection. For constant exotropia, you should go for ortho. For sensory deviations, ESO or exo, you should leave slight exo because you expect the eye to go out because of the nature of the deviation. And if you're doing bimedial resection, at least in my hands, I do expect some correction even till 3 months and maximum in first month. So I do plan a slight undercorrection. I know there would be surgeons who would not be planning a slight undercorrection, but I do plan around 4 to 5 prisms of undercorrection. Adjustables when they are to be done. So mostly I would do I would put my surgeries on adjustable if it is a resurgery. Double vision patients, if I am doing a Farden surgery, if they are very small deviations, like less than 16 prisms, less than 14 prisms, and I have to do the surgery, I would be putting the patient on adjustable. And when you are doing both eyes together, like you have very large angle exotropia, in right eye you are doing R&R procedure, you are doing a recession, doing a resection, and also you are adding a third muscle in other eye, you would be planning to do an adjustable. Now, this is also another question because there are different as our mentor, Dr. Kushner, used to say, there are more than one way of doing the same thing, and there are more than one way of reaching orthophoria. So, how much to dissect? Now, I have been lucky enough to have worked with a lot of senior people. There are a lot of senior people already there in our panel also. But different people have different ways of operating the muscles. There are some surgeons who do a lot of dissection. And then there are others who don't not at all do the dissections. I would be talking about what I do. So we do separate the muscle from the conjunctiva. You have to do that. But we do dissect the intermuscular septums. And if there are check ligaments, we can see. You should always try to preserve the muscle sheath. Because the muscle sheath is nothing but the condensation of the tenons. And so what it does is, it prevents the host of adhesions. And never do blunt dissection. Try to do sharp dissection. And try to use a magnification magnification in a device, a microscope or a loop. Try to dissect on the conjunctival side to prevent bleeding and see and dissect. You should never dissect areas which are not visible. Just a line on vortex vein that they are a reality, although we don't see them very often, but they are a reality and they do exist and they do bleed profusely when you try to touch them or by chance if you do that. Limbal fornix, so I started my journey as I used to do through limbal route, and now I do fornix route. I don't think there's any instance superior. It is about your own ease and comfort. Yes, squint surgery is part of it is cosmetic. The part is also there. So fornix, for instance, may be better because scars are under the lids. And fornix incisions do preserve limbal blood supply. So theoretically, they would be at a better chance in a compromised patient who is at a risk of intersegment ischemia. Again, vertical muscles, you have to see the presence of binocular vision, which gaze is affected because vertical muscles are slightly different from horizontal muscles, even when they are committed, because When you operate a medial rectus or a lateral rectus recession, you don't see undercorrection in primary gaze position. But if you operate an inferior rectus, there may be a small undercorrection in the primary action of the muscle in the down gaze. So it is very important to understand and then operate these patients. Whether there is any presence or absence of torsion, a lot of times, we tend to forget that since we don't see torsion outside, we tend to forget that this is also another aspect of strabismus. And it is very important not to disturb the primary position. If we are doing oblique muscles, we should try to avoid concomitant surgeries. If there is no angle in primary position, we should not do very strong surgeries. We should try to see which particular gaze is affected and try to operate the muscle which is depending on that gaze. We, as far as possible, recessions should be done more predictable. They are more predictable, and we are weakening the antagonist of the parietic muscle, and weakening of yoke muscles are more common options than trying to do a recession. So, and amount of I would. There are some of the surgeries, it is better to leave them because of the time constraint. So. Just a small video. No, not this. Thank you so much for the patient listening, and thank you for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Dr. Jitendra. Shall I introduce the next speaker? We have Dr. Pradeep with us. Dr. Pradeep Sharma, you may unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted and I'm audible.
Yes, and your screen, yes, you're audible, sir. And your screen sharing, we can see your screen.
Thank you. So, it's a pleasure to be here in a nuts and bolts sessions for the Airways Kolkata, which is being held online this time. And today I'm going to talk about the close encounters of the third nerve palsy as a paralytic strabismus. The third nerve palsy is one of the most challenging problems in strabismus because it involves so many extraocular muscles in the orbit. And apart from the extraocular muscles which are holding the globe, it also affects the LPS, or the causing a ptosis, and also involves the pupil. So it will be a very comprehensive effect if there is a third nerve palsy. And in addition, if it happens in a childhood because of the ptosis, it may also be a cause of amblyopia. How do we manage third nerve palsies? Now, a complete oculomotor diagnosis has to be made. It may be variable in different cases because of the variable involvement of the different extraocular muscles in each individual. The cause may be different, and you have to be looking for, and in the older people, elderly, more than 45 years of age, there may be a vascular ischemic insult which causes a third nerve palsy, which is known as ischemic mononeuropathy. So look for causes like hypertension, diabetes mellitus, coronary artery deficiency, or any CVA problem which may be causing it. Neurologic problems can be there otherwise in addition, and that may be in the form of intracranial space occupying lesion, any aneurysm which may be even affecting a younger individual, and a trauma of course can cause a third nerve palsy. In general, a natural recovery is what we would like to wait after investigating the cases. So once we have found out the cause and we have decided that nothing urgent needs to be done, then we need to wait for a 6-weekly interval or 2-monthly interval to see the recovery. And many of the paralytic strabismus, especially if they are ischemic in origin, they would recover by 3 months of age. But otherwise, we may have to wait for almost like 6 to 9 months in third nerve palsies to see if the recovery is occurring. And a 2-monthly change can guide you whether you need to wait for full 9 months or more even. Crutch glasses are required if ptosis is complete and cannot be done by surgery. And otherwise, the surgery would be handling. And as Dr. Jitendra had mentioned, we should always look for the fixating eye because the primary versus secondary deviation may be different, and you may have to decide which to take into account while you're operating depending on the vision and the dominant eye. In third nerve palsies, it's important to tell the patient the realistic goals. because we may be able to correct only the deviations in primary positions and slightly in down gaze, which are the more important positions. And it may not always be possible to correct in all gazes. In addition, aberrant regenerations are possible in third nerve palsies. So in third nerve palsies, we'll go some cases for presentation's sake. This is case 1 in which you can see a face turn to the left side. She has an exotropia. There is an adduction deficiency in the right eye. But the good thing is that the eye is crossing the midline. So in such a situation, an R&R or an RNP, that means a recession and resection or recession and plication, may be done to correct the horizontal deviation and restore the smile and the deviation and the alignment of the patient. A simple weakening procedure may be done. This may be a conventional recession or adjustable hangback recession, which may be done. And nowadays, when we have more demanding patients, we may do an adjustable procedure. For strengthening, we may use resection, or the new kid on the block for strengthening the muscle is a reinforced plication. Now, this case, another case we have in which you can see a third nerve palsy. This girl had it, and she does not have a complete third nerve palsy. The ptosis, fortunately, is not there. There is an adduction deficiency, which is slight, but majorly it is an infraduction problem. It's an inferior division third nerve palsy. And in this case, we would look for the force duction test. The force duction shows that the FDT for both lateral rectus and the superior rectus is free. So I decided to do a modified inverse snap procedure. The right lateral rectus was disinserted and reinserted without any recession to the right inferior rectus, and the right medial rectus was resected 6 millimeters and reinserted at the right inferior rectus. And as you can see, it has given us good results, correction in the primary position, improved the infraduction, as well as even corrected the adduction which is there. So this is another situation of a third nerve palsy. This is a case 3 of a third nerve palsy, and you see here there is almost a complete third nerve palsy involving the ptosis, and it's such a large exodeviation, and the FDT for the lateral rectus was also positive. And such a case, we decided to do a lateral rectus Y-split and shifting it to the medial anchoring, so that it's a medial transposition of the split lateral rectus. And as you can see here, the exotropia has been corrected. So a single lateral rectus muscle surgery has achieved the exodeviation correction as well as improved the adduction. The ptosis was still there. And in this case, because the elevation was markedly deficient, I chose to do the lateral rectus, the superior rectus of the left eye weakening, and that has helped in improving the vertical deviation and also improved the ptosis to some extent. Another case is shown here, and in which there is a very large exotropia of about 90 prisms and a tight lateral rectus. In very tight lateral rectus, you may do a supramaximal recession, or you may do a periosteal anchoring of the lateral rectus, and in addition do a medial rectus resection. So in this case, 8 millimeters medial rectus resection was done. This is mostly to anchor the globe medially. Sometimes the medial rectus is so lax that it does not give you enough anchoring effect. So in such a case, you can do a medial periosteal anchoring of the globe actually to the periosteum. And this is what we had published in JPOS in 2006. And you can see a 90 prisms exotropia has been corrected after the lateral rectus being recessed supramaximally and also anchored to the globe on the medial side. So this is a periosteal anchoring with the globe. Cases which have an aberrant regeneration are a little more interesting and different way to solve. Now this case had an aberrant regeneration. You can see a pseudo von Graffe sign. On looking down and on adduction, the lid gets lifted up. And fortunately, there is an improvement in adduction by the MR coming in innervation. So you have a exotropia which is corrected to quite a bit. And so in such a case, you may not actually do any surgery, just explain to the patient about the aberrant degeneration of the lid and refer it to an oculoplastic surgeon to do something. Now this girl on the other hand has an aberrant degeneration with an exotropia. So I chose to operate on the horizontal recti on the other eye. The contralateral recession and resection of the right eye was done in a case in which left third nerve palsy, and you can see here the left ptosis has got corrected because we have taken advantage of the aberrant regeneration. Now another case of a 20-year-old who had an outward deviation of since the last 1 year, and we saw that there was an aberrant regeneration in this lateral rectus recession again of the other eye has been done 15 millimeters with the MR plication of 8 mm, and as you can see here how nicely the ptosis also gets corrected along with the horizontal deviation. Mind you, the horizontal deviation has been corrected by operating on the contralateral eye. So you need to counsel the patient properly that this is what we need to do in this case. Sometimes there can be a unique presentation in which there is a total absence of the medial rectus. And this was a congenital aplasia of medial rectus. And this girl, she had almost like 120 prisms of exotropia. We decided to do a lateral rectus recession in both the eyes and also do a modified Nishida's procedure. Now, and you can see that the adduction is improved, the exo gets corrected, as well as the movements are restored in adduction also. So you have different ways of handling. The modified Nishida's procedure is a recent procedure which is very useful because in this we don't do any disinsertion, no splitting, so there is no risk of anti-segment ischemia. We are directly transferring the force of the vertical recti directly to the sclera. It's like the direct bank transfer of money without any middleman, which would have taken away the money elsewhere. Superior oblique transposition was a surgery done a long time back, and we did about 15-20 years back. We found that it yields correction of the exo, but it will give rise to aberrant movements in the vertical directions, and so it would not be a recommended procedure anymore by us. The congenital cranial dysnervation disorder is a topic which we talked about later on. I would just like to say that in that also it's a third nerve which will present as CFUMs, synergistic divergence or synergistic innervational downshoot, which we have described, or a Marcus-Gunn jaw winking phenomenon. And if you do an imaging, you can confirm the absence of the third nerve and a synergistic divergence child which is there. In this, we have operated by a lateral rectus Y-split and anchored to the medial side and improved the adduction very nicely. So this is what I would like to say. Taking care of the imaging, we can do a targeted strabismus surgery, identify the misinnervation and transpose the misdirected muscle to the correct side and improve the gaze as well as adduction. I would like to tell you that we need to be squintellectuals and restore the alignment and binocular vision in our patients and give back the happiness to all our children. And this is what is the message I would like to give you all. Thank you very much for a patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeep, for very elaborate and interesting talks. If there are any questions, we can take them now. I think the audience is very little, so I think there are hardly any. Maybe we can take them at the end of the session. Now we have the next speaker is Dr. Shreya, and she'll be talking about restrictive strabismus, the diagnostic conundrum. Dr. Shreya, please.
Good afternoon. Am I audible, sir? And slides are visible?
Yeah, it's visible, and your presentation also is visible.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I'm grateful to Dr. Pandey, sir, for allowing me to speak on restrictive strabismus. If you look at the restrictive strabismus, there are 4 categories. Restriction in whole muscle. These many disease can cause. Restriction in the muscle belly, thyroid ophthalmopathy. Restriction in muscle tendon and belly, pseudotumor, and resistance to the muscle action. So we'll talk in all this. This is Drashti's data. Around 30% had strabismus which were restriction. For that, we need to ask proper history. Any previous surgery, any trauma, any injections, any systemic disorder, any family history or any history of infection. Thorough examination from external to retina should be done. Full strabismus workup, especially all motor evaluation. Gaze-specific intraocular pressure should be measured and orbital examination also for the tumor evaluation. We need systemic evaluation like thyroid profile and blood counts and support of the imaging, CT scan, MRI, ultrasonography. But to detect this restrictive strabismus, force reduction test and force generation test is the thing, and in restrictive strabismus we'll get good saccades also. So this boy had a congenital fibrotic syndrome, which is restrictive strabismus, can come in family, can come as a sporadic. This 3-year girl had vision, only movement and the down only, rest of the movement were not there. So between 6 months of multiple surgeries, we could give this result. Still she had little exo. We need to correct that. 24-year male again presented with lateral rectus congenital fibrotic syndrome, and we did periosteal fixation here. Duans we all know, and I'll not discuss lot here because we discuss in all strabismus conferences. So this is also a cause. monocular elevation deficiency, especially the restrictive variety. But in turn, whenever there is paralytic variety, in turn it becomes restrictive because of the antagonists become fibrosed. Still, the pathophysiology is not known, maybe congenital. But in our hand, inferior rectus supramaximal recession works well, and sometimes we may have to add with the naps also, and that gives good correction also. Brown's, we all know, deficit elevation in children in adduction, and these also are not discussed much here because we all are sitting and we are discussing Brown syndrome lot many times. Bilateral Browns also can be there. Management simply is SO loosening by any means, pre-tenectomy, tenotomy, guarded tenotomy. But before surgery, look into the scan. So there should not be anything on the trochlea. This 65-year male presented before 11 years with esotropia since childhood, and forced reduction test for the abduction was strongly positive. So we suspected tight muscle. We started operating. This is old video of 2009. We made a paralimbal incision. So since it was a tight muscle, it was very difficult to pass the second hook under the muscle also. Somehow we could, and the moment we started passing the suture of muscle went off. So it can happen with anybody, anytime with a tight muscle. Somehow in this patient, we could find the muscle. To put this thing here, this is post-operative photo and video of this patient. To put this thing here just for the tips and tricks in certain conditions. Do not lose the patients, be calm and cool. And as Dr. Jethani said, that preserve the sheath. That works best when it's a tight muscle. But of course, prevention is better than cure. So if you have FDT strongly positive, keep some types of instruments ready, like this double hook. When you can pass, you don't have to put two hooks and you don't need assistance also. Some kind of spatula which prevents your needle sliding into the sclera. So prevent the sheet is also. This lady presented at 30 years of age, and when after eliciting history, she gave the history of sinus surgery. So the things, CT scan showing medial and inferior rectus together. So we separated that, we did recession, we could give her a ortho position, and later on we treated with the palpebral fissure changes also. Post-injection scarring also can cause, like nowadays people are putting bupivacaine, which is known for thickening the muscle, and also orbital inflammation, which causes the scarring. Endocrine myopathy, like thyroid ophthalmopathy, is the disease which causes restrictive strabismus. Here the muscle will be involved, so CT scan will tell us everything. This kind of patient, before treating, we must know the classification. We usually follow UGOGO classification, but we must know what the Rundle curve is. Rundle curve is 6 to 24 months, and till that time patient gets in a stable condition. So on which stage the Rundle curve patient is, according to that we can treat the strabismus. Once the acute inflammation subsides, we can even give Botox and we can operate for surgery also. But even in 6% of, nearly 6% cases will have optic neuropathy. So be careful that for that, and for that we may have to send the patient for radiation first. So immunosuppression, orbital irradiation, and orbital decompression can be sometimes done together. But once the inflammation subsides, we can do orbital surgery, strabismus surgery, and eyelid surgery also. To do the decompression, we have to see the size and depth of orbit, muscle, position of sinus, and bone of thickness of the bone. So this is the thing available for us, decompression, 1 wall, 2 wall, 3 wall, whatever we want to do. Similar condition, it looks resembling, but it's not. It is a pseudo tumor. So this imaging will tell us everything, although it will be a painful restriction of movement. This guy had a very strong pseudo tumor and whole orbit was involved. We had to give him immunosuppression, though the cornea was involved. Then we did tarsography, and then we could save some of the vision in this patient. We all know blowout fracture. I'll talk more on Sunday about this. Tear drop sign is the sign. We have to treat immediately. These are the post-operatives. Muscle entrapment in children have to be taken care of as fast as possible in order to avoid the cardiac reflex. This is a very good video of force generation test. So you can see how the lateral rectus is generating the force. So that everybody must know. This is also Lefort fracture, which interrupted the inferior rectus muscle. Immediately we need to take care. We could give ortho. Later on, we can take care of the palpebral changes. Other causes like symblepharon and vascular causes needs to be taken care if patient has a trauma history. So superior ophthalmic vein dilatation will tell us about the carotico-cavernous fistula. After ligation of vessel, we may have to operate for strabismus. This is interesting 35-year male presenting to us, and he is saying, I have some pain and looking at down and diplopia and confusion also. So when I saw the report and eliciting history, he gave the clear history about COVID. And he had been operated for 2 times for sinus surgery. Then we injected retrobulbar amphotericin B. This is 1 week post-op, and he regained all the movements also. Another lady also post-COVID we treated. So don't forget about the orbital involvement of with the mucormycosis. When patient has fever and this kind of picture, look for the orbital cellulitis. Manage properly. This kind of patient may go into septicemia. Medical IV antibiotics has to be given. Orbital tumor, this guy looks very less exotropia, but when you look at the CT, it's very huge mass lying near the medial wall. So that needs to be taken care. Another boy also had the same problem. Very big mass under the inferior rectus, though the inferior rectus was quite free. We operated, did orbitotomy, and inferior rectus we made the free. The swelling also, proptosis also lessened, and we sent this picture photo for HPE, sample for HPE, and it turned out schwannoma of the orbit. This baby looks very normal when she looks down, but if she looks up, recently she got a huge glioma. She is right now under chemotherapy. She'll come back tomorrow. So in conclusion, we have 4 varieties and we have all the tests available. Through that only we need to know a complete history, thorough workup of strabismus, support of radiological investigation, blood investigation, proper understanding of post-reduction test and generation test will give, and proper planning and preparation gives us the success. Thanks to my patients, thanks to my teachers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shreya. That was really insightful. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. We have Dr. Pramod coming up next.
Yeah, I had a little problem with the electricity. I had lost connection,
No worries, sir.
and I've just got back.
No worries, sir.
Thank you so much.
We have Dr. Pramod Kumar Pandey with us as our next speaker. So do you need some AV support? No. Okay.
No, I have got it, I think. No, I'll be talking on diagnosing skew deviation. Skew deviations, as we know, they are quite rare. They neither follow any laws of motility. They could behave like comitant, they could behave like incomitant, and they are quite often quite relatively silent, so one may miss it. So the idea is to talk about them so that we don't miss them and we are able to diagnose them and treat them accordingly. I'm not able to move this slide.
So just single click on your screen.
Problem with this slide. Yeah. Now skew. I'm sorry for little confusion. Now, light from the sky above and gravity from below are the 2 physical constants to life. Balance and verticality are very pivotal for survival. The 2 vestibules and the 2 eyes serve as balance organs in lockstep. Now, for balance, we need bilateral weighted autolytic inputs. They modulate the extraocular muscle and postural tonus. The asymmetrical autolytic inputs lead to vertical divergence, that is skew, and conjugate torsion. So, a symmetry is very important. If there is no symmetry, there is going to be a problem. You can look at this monkey. If he did not have autolytic symmetrical inputs, he is going to fall down and with serious consequences. Now this is showing the autolytic pathways. Starting from the vestibule, we have the vestibular nerve, which will both supply the utricle saccule and the semicircular canals. From there, they will go to the vestibular nuclei, which you all know are in the medulla, upper part of the medulla and the pons. There are a group of nuclei, medial, lateral. We are not going into that, superior and inferior. And from there, these two will join the utricle saccule, and the semicircular canal fibers will join here, and from there they will cross over at the level of the sixth nerve, go to the opposite side, ascend in the medial longitudinal fasciculus along the third nerve, fourth nerve, go till the right up to the right RI MLF, and with INC sitting on top. So INC is a very important structure for the torsional and vertical movement integration, and these fibers cross in the posterior commissure also. So any lesion anywhere along this path can give rise to skew deviation. Now this is about the semicircular canals. As you can see, the anterior canal is going to excite superior rectus of the same side and inferior oblique of the opposite side, and inhibit inferior rectus of the same side and contralateral superior oblique. The posterior canal is going to excite ipsilateral superior oblique and contralateral inferior rectus, and inhibit ipsilateral inferior oblique and contralateral superior rectus. So in push-pull mechanism, they maintain balance. Now this is showing if there is a damage to the anterior or posterior canal pathways, what is going to happen. Now if you have damage to the anterior canal pathways, that means you will have what is happening here in this part. The IR is gone, so the SR is gone, so this eye is going to be hypertrophic. Here the inferior oblique is affected, so the SO is going to overact and create intorsion. So the net effect will be that this eye will be hypo, the right eye, and the left eye will be intorted. In the case of the posterior canal pathways, this is going to supply the superior oblique here and the IR here. So this eye is going to rise and this eye is going to extort. So the net effect of both these will be that there is going to be large vertical with intorsion of this eye. The hyper eye will be intorted and the eye which is lower will be extorted. So you will have a conjugate torsion and a large vertical. Now this is not constant that in all the cases you will have similar presentation. Some will have more torsion, some may have more vertical. So all the combinations are possible. And this stays quite comitant because the obliques are still acting. The inferior oblique of this side and the superior oblique of this side, they are still working. So in side gazes, it remains relatively constant. But if there is asymmetry of involvement here with AC and PC, then you may have an incomitant ocular tilt reaction, what we call as incomitant. So that changes with the gaze position. Now this is showing the structures which are lying nearby. Basically, this skew deviation is a problem of the posterior fossa. So the structures in the posterior fossa are the cerebellum, as you know, medulla, and the pons, midbrain. So these are the areas which are affected in skew deviations. Any lesion here can give rise to skew deviation. The structures which are lying close by are as you know, the vestibular nuclei and the MLF, the INC. So all these structures are close by. So any lesion which is involving these structures can also give rise to skew deviation along with this. Now this is showing skew deviation in 3 dimensions. One is that there is you have in Rall plane, that is what we call as ocular tilt reaction, the anterior posterior axis, that is the ocular tilt reaction. The other is interoral, the pitch plane, where you have what is known as laterally alternating skew deviation. And the third is yaw, where you have acute acquired comitant esotropia. Now in the Rall plane, as we have a complete ocular tilt reaction which has 3 components. The oculomotor, which has the skew, the vertical deviation which you were just talking about, which is the most prominent component and give rise to diplopia. Then you have conjugate torsion, that is intorsion of the higher eye and extorsion of the lower eye, which is known as ocular counter roll. And this is a conjugate torsion which you see classically, we'll be seeing it later. And then you have a head tilt to the same side. So all these 3 components to one side constitute ocular tilt reaction. Now it is important to look at torsion in these cases because some of these may actually not complain of too much of torsion because this is an adaptation to their damage to the autolytic pathways. So it is important to look at this, and you will find that once you put a double Maddox rod, you will find gross extorsion and torsion in both the eyes. There is another thing important to keep in mind, that when these patients lie down, there is a change in the vertical deviation and torsion. The vertical deviation and torsion, that is conjugate torsion, may disappear in a large number of these patients as compared to superior oblique palsy, where it is not going to change. So to distinguish skew deviations from other cyclovertical issues, you must make them lie down and look at their vertical and torsion in supine position. Now this is showing the conjugate torsion. You can see gross intorsion in the left eye and gross extorsion in the left eye. Usually it is quite gross, so you don't mix up. I mean, this is not something which is gray or which is dubious. I mean, small amount of torsion, which is not, I mean, any doubt about it. Now, head tilt tests are usually negative in these cases, but in some cases they may come as positive also, and they create difficulty with diagnosis like a superior oblique palsy, because there also you may find a head tilt test which is positive. So this creates a diagnostic difficulty. Now, the etiologies, as we were talking, there could be brainstem strokes, tuberculomas, tumors, hydrocephalus, anal-cherry malformations, trauma. These are important ones. Important ones like tuberculomas are important to us, and strokes, of course, because we have a lot of diabetes and hypertension. Now, the phyllotravelus could be isolated, as we said, or there could be an internuclear ophthalmoplegia. There could be a pretectal syndrome, a nystagmus. You can have ataxia and vertigo, but they are not very common accompaniments. Usually, nystagmus is quite important to keep in mind, and if you don't look at it, you may miss it. Now, the clinical features will be a tilt in the subjective visual vertical, SVV, which we did not talk because it is quite often asymptomatic. Then you have conjugate torsion and AHP, which may be symptomatic, as we have talked. There is a vertical diplopia, which may be symptomatic. Head tilt test, as we said, is usually negative. There is no primary and secondary deviation in these cases. The OTR could be competent, incompetent, complete, or incomplete, depending upon the involvement of the fibers. And there is no spread of competence with time, and there is no pattern strabismus in these cases. Now, this is some cases I'll share. This is the one we were showing. Now, you can see that there is an INO in this left INO. The left eye is hyper, and there is no abducting nystagmus in this patient. So, in a routine way, you will think this is just maybe an INO, and there is nothing more. But if you look at the torsion, you find that the same patient had intorsion of the left eye, right eye, quite prominent. This is showing another patient, the pretectal syndrome and skew deviation. The left eye is hyper, as you can see, and there is a large exo, and the depression is also affected. These patients often have pupils which are mid-dilated, and convergence may be affected. Now, if you look at his fundus again, you will find that there is a right oculotil reaction. The right eye is extorted and lower, and the left eye is hyper. So you have to really look for skew deviation. If you don't look for it, you will miss it. This is showing that after 6 months and after 1 year, there has been change in the torsion. The extorsion, which was very gross, has improved a lot. So with time, they do undergo change. So it is very important to wait and see at least for 6 months to 1 year in these cases. This is showing on MRI that there is a small left thalamic infarct in this case, which was responsible for this. It was a ischemic infarct. Now, this is another case which was mixing up with a bilateral superior oblique palsy. There is a large ESO, in fact, in the primary gaze and increasing in the down gaze. So one may also think of a lateral rectal, but there is abducting hypertropia. So this is and it is coming on the head tilt test. So it is a bilateral superior oblique to look at. Now, if you look at the fundus, in this case, again you find that there is a left oculotilt reaction. The right eye is hyper, and left oculotilt reaction. The right eye is intorted and left eye is extorted. The disc also looks a bit hyperemic. Probably what has happened because of the tumor, there has been pressure against the tentorium, against the fourth nerve, which has given rise to this bilateral superior oblique palsy. Now, this is again showing change after about 1 year. You can see the intorsion, which was there in the right eye, has converted into extorsion, and the other eye extorsion has diminished. So with time, what has happened? The skew deviation has resolved. So with that resolution, now it is presenting as bilateral superior oblique palsy. This is showing the large pilocytic astrocytoma, which was present in this patient and which was operated. Now, you can also have an incomplete oculotilt reaction, as I was saying. This could be if there is unilateral damage to the asymmetrical damage to the canal pathways. If there is a posterior canal pathway damage, it will give rise to extorsion. And if there is anterior canal pathway damage, it will give rise to intorsion. This is showing another patient. Again, looks like that there is a left INO, and there is a nystagmus in this patient, left eye also, abducting nystagmus. And if you look at this, you find that the left eye is intorted, whereas the right eye torsion is normal. So this is an incomplete picture. It is not essential to have that both eyes are showing conjugate torsion. Quite often you have more of extorsion than intorsion, but in this case, it is other way around. This is showing a large tuberculosis in the pons area, which was causing the problem. This is again in yaw plane. You have an acute acquired competent esotropia here due to diffuse CNS tuberculomas. You have large ESO. There is no limitation of movements. The abduction is full. There is no pattern. And if you look at the MRI, there are large tuberculomas sitting in the pons and the cerebellum in this case, which are probably responsible for this acute acquired competent esotropia. There was no refractive error, no hypermetropia to have caused this or no other lesion. This is showing resolution with anti-tubercular therapy after 3 months also. He had improved a great deal. Now this is again showing torsion, which was extorsion and torsion in this side, like it's fitting with the right ocular tilt reaction. So you must look at the torsion in these cases also, which are suspected to be acute acquired competent esotropia because of CNS involvement. They are very small cases, but they are very sort of serious matter, because if you miss them, they can end up with a lot of difficulties. And quite often this is a presenting symptom, the acute acquired competent esotropia. So one has to keep this possibility in mind while evaluating these patients. Now look for skews in acquired strabismus, INOs, gaze palsies, and acute acquired competent esotropias. Pretectal syndromes include subjective objective torsion and head position dependent changes as fourth and fifth step in your examination. Keep low threshold for suspicion. Order neuroimaging and neurological evaluation. Wait for resolution because most of them do resolve. And surgical options are mostly limited to recti with variable outcomes. So the surgical results are not always very good. So one has to be careful in what we are doing. Thank you. I hope I didn't take more time because there was no watch working with me.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod Kumar.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Do you want to take it quickly?
I think it was a difficult topic, so maybe people that they have some time, they might ask one or two questions at the end of the session.
So let's take the next speaker then.
Yeah, please.
All right. I'd like to call Dr. Elizabeth Joseph. Elizabeth Joseph to please unmute herself. Switch your camera on. And you've already started sharing your screen.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Good evening, ma'am. Yes, you're audible. You have 10 minutes. You'll be able to see the timer as well.
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. P.K. Pandey sir for inviting me to be in this symposium. And I'm extremely glad to be here, especially to share this virtual meeting with great stalwarts in strabismus like Professor Subhash Dadhia sir, Pradeep Sharma sir, V.K. Pandey sir, Dr. Shreya, Dr. Jitendra, and all others, as Dr. Pradeep Sharma sir says, squintilectuals. Yeah. Now I will be sharing my experience with Brown syndrome. Yeah. Brown syndrome comes under those congenital cranial dysinnervation syndrome. It has got a typical signs, especially the deficient elevation in adduction with normal elevation in abduction, or near normal elevation in the primary position, which is always associated with a restricted force duction. There may be a superior oblique overaction, V pattern divergence, and associated anomalous head posture, hypertropia in primary position, and downshoots. These are rare signs. And Brown syndrome could be either congenital or acquired. When we talk about congenital Brown syndrome, actually it is more or less asymptomatic, except probably a little bit of abnormal head posture and motility issues, whereas acquired is sudden onset, diplopia will be there, tenderness over the trochlea, and etiology could be inflammatory, traumatic, maybe due to bursitis, iatrogenic, maybe due to superior oblique tuck or some sinus surgeries, or it could be cysticercosis. So in acquired Browns, always you should be doing an imaging. This is a child who presented to us with a sudden onset of head posture. You can see the chin up position, and the patient had history of rheumatoid arthritis, and on examination, typical motility problem of defective elevation in the adducted position. So imaging was done, and there was a thickening of the superior oblique region. There was no cyst there, and since the child was already diagnosed as rheumatoid arthritis, we thought it is also along with that, and treated with systemic anti-inflammatory agents, paratrochlear steroid injection, and the patient fully recovered in 1 month's time. So there is a full recovery of acquired Browns. Some people say that even after recovery, there will be a residual deviation, but in my case, there is no residual deviation, there is a full recovery. And coming to congenital Browns, there are the dilemmas. The most important dilemma is whether we have to do the surgery or not. It is well known that spontaneous resolution of congenital Brown is possible. And again, another factor is that surgical success rate is not that very good. These are two things which we have to keep in mind so that you don't do surgery in all cases. There is some absolute indication for surgery. Otherwise, we don't do surgery in mild cases of Browns. Absolute indications are those severe cases of Browns plus with unacceptable head tilt or chin elevation, primary position hypotropia, downshoot in adduction or threat to binocularity. See, this child has got a primary position hypotropia. Patient presents with a head tilt, chin elevated position, and there is a downshoot. So this is a severe Brown syndrome or Browns plus. This has to be operated. And dilemma 2 is what surgery is to be done. There are different procedures, and it's always a dilemma to select. I have listed the different types of surgeries in the order of success rate and the order of popularity. Nowadays, most surgeons have resorted to chicken suture in Brown syndrome. Second option is the superior oblique tendon spacer with silicone band. Some people are very fond of doing superior oblique tendon lengthening. Actually, these three procedures, it's a personal choice between different surgeons. Other procedures like tendon recession, tenectomy, tenotomy, etc. has got very bad results like superior oblique palsies and other altered movements, and hence it's seldom done nowadays. The superior oblique chicken suture surgery and even the spacer surgery, both of them are controlled surgery. And these have got the best success rate. Both these procedures are reversible in the early stages and can be repeated in the early stages, but not very late. If you are doing it after many months, because of adhesions and fibrosis, it will be difficult to do resurgeries. But in the early stages, it's always, you can go back and do surgery. And iatrogenic superior oblique palsy is rare in spacer surgery, but it is only rare, but it still can occur, and mild superior oblique palsies are reported even in spacer surgeries, like in this article published in JAPOS. See, I'll show a small video of her.
You can just put slideshow, then only it will play.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so thank you for reminding me. Superior oblique chicken suture for Browns. Before doing surgery, we have to do an exaggerated force reduction test and see whether there is a restriction in elevation. See, you can see that in the nasal side, it is difficult to move the globe in upwards. So there is a force reduction is positive. Once the force reduction is positive, you can go ahead with the superior oblique surgery. You open up the superior oblique by conjunctival incision 8 millimeters behind the limbus, which is extended laterally. And after the tenons also is exposed, tenons is incised, and then you go for the superior rectus muscle. Once the superior rectus is exposed and is on the muscle hook, I always put a stay suture under the superior rectus. A stay suture is placed under the superior rectus, and superior rectus can be slightly pulled laterally so that the region of the superior oblique is better visualized. Under direct visualization, the superior oblique muscle has to be hooked. You can see that the superior oblique tendon is too tight, and I am putting two muscle hooks on the proximal and distal part of the tendon, and I am using a 5-0 Mercilin non-absorbable suture. First is passed at the distal end of the tendon. First a partial thickness bite, and then a full thickness bite is taken, so that the entire width of the superior oblique is in the suture. And once you pass the suture on the proximal part, a small loop has to be made, and the length of the loop can be adjusted. It may be anything from 8 to 10 millimeters or less, and the length of the loop has to be titrated depending on looking at the fundus torsion and looking at the force reduction test after the completion of the surgery. And so I have taken a loop and then taken the sutures on the proximal part of the tendon, and after putting these sutures, I'm adjusting the length of the loop as much as I want. I have taken about 10 millimeters of the loop, and the distance between the two sutures is about 5 millimeters. You can do it at 2 millimeters, but then if you do it at 2 millimeters, the chance of sutures cutting through is very high. So 5 millimeters, 4 to 5 millimeters space is very good. After passing the sutures like this and making the loop, the muscle has to be cut in the middle. The tendon has to be cut in the middle. And after cutting the tendon, you have to allow the tendon to retract. Here I'm again fixing the loops. Any non-absorbable suture can be used. It's better to have a double-armed cutting needle. This surgery is easier than the spacer technique, and we are not introducing any foreign body in the superior rectus region, so that postoperatively superior rectus is free to move. There will not be any additions with the superior rectus. So in my opinion, this is a superior surgery than the spacer. Spacer practically, theoretically, spacer also is good. Spacer means silicon band. This also is a spacer, suture spacer. See, the tenotomy is done. It's a full tenotomy, and now we are allowing the muscles to retract. At this point, we have to come back and do the force reduction test. Make sure that the force reduction is possible. You should be able to move the globe freely, superiorly in the nasal side. Then only the surgery will be successful. See the force reduction. It's easy to move the globe superiorly. So we are expecting a good result. The advantage of chicken suture is that it is reversible, technically easier, intraoperative adjustment can be done. And this is the diagrammatic representation of spacer, where you use a silicon band, a piece of 240 retinal band, which is kept between the two cut ends of the superior oblique. This is the surgical picture. This is the silicon band sutured between the two cut ends of the superior oblique. This is a little more difficult than the chicken suture, and the length of this band can vary from 4 to 8 millimeters. See, this is one child with a Brown syndrome, right Brown's. This is the postoperative picture. These pictures look very beautiful. This was taken 18 months later, but no, this spacer technique was done. Immediate postoperative result was very good, but gradually the patient developed superior oblique paralysis, and I had to do inferior oblique recession in the same eye and inferior rectus recession of the opposite eye, maybe some 3 years later in this child. And I'll come to the split tendon lengthening procedure.
Ma'am, we'd like you to wind up.
Yeah, I'll split tendon lengthening is again you split the tendon between the two muscle hooks or clamps and suture it together. And the advantage of split tendon is that it is easier, but the most difficult part of this is that you have to work with the very small tendon, and so it is easy to cut off. Superior oblique tenectomy and tenotomy, I won't advise at all. It will produce superior oblique palsy. So I would conclude saying that all dilemmas are closed. Surgery is done only if it is severe Browns, and preferred surgery is either chicken suture, silicon band, or split tendon. And then between these three, it is individual choice. Thank you very much for patient hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elizabeth. I just wanted to say some things. One is that can you hear me?
Yeah.
One is that 60 circus we see in North, lot of 60 circus we have seen, 60 circus of the superior oblique or even the tendon, and they present with a very severe Browns. I have published 2 cases, and they also have superior oblique underaction, what is known as canine tooth syndrome, you know.
Yeah.
I have published one that way also. And so this 60 circus has to be kept in mind, at least in North India. Now, of course, we are seeing less of 60 circus now, but earlier when I was younger, we saw a lot of it.
I have seen acquired Browns more than 10-15 cases, not a single case of cystic circus. I image all the cases. Probably it is not there in our part.
Maybe South is more hygienic as compared to North. The 60 circus. The other thing is about downshoot and widening of the aperture. This is part of the disinnervation. That means these cases are getting some disinnervation from the third nerve. So these will pass into CCDDs actually. Those which have this widening of the fissure and downshoot, they are actually CCDDs because they are getting the innervation from the third nerve, the inferior oblique and those areas. So I think that needs to be stressed in the congenital Browns. And the third thing is about, as you said, that these cases don't have overaction of the superior oblique. Most of these, they will be having, the superior oblique is not overacting in these cases, mostly. That is why you end up with a superior oblique palsy. So it is a very real problem with the Browns, that a good number, as you were rightly saying, they end up with the superior oblique palsy. So one has to be very careful about indication and very careful about when you do it. And immediately post-op, some of them may not have very good results, and with time they get better. Some end up with superior oblique palsy also. So it is said that in fact you do FDT, you find it is quite okay, but next day you find the results are not as good as you had seen on the table.
Yeah.
So that is my experience, and some improvement takes place with time also in these cases, maybe over a month or 2 months. But the results are not as good as they look on the table. And of course, one can also monitor intorsion in these cases, the FDT and intorsion, what is happening, how much is the intorsion there already present, and how much you are getting after the weakening procedure. Dr. Pradeep, would you like to say something?
I think for that reason, it's better to have a surgery which can be controlled. So you need to have an adjustable procedure or some procedure which you can undo or change it on the as required. My choice procedure is nowadays the hanging loop tenotomy. That means it's an adjustable recession of the superior oblique, which gives very good results. And the best part is that the sutures are in the temporal part. The problem with the chicken suture is that you are handling all the adhesions will happen in the nasal part, which is a very crowded area, and adhesions will form. So that will give rise to problem with the motility of the superior oblique. So it is better to do it on the temporal side. Even Kenneth Wright has said, when you're doing the spacer also, you should approach it from the temporal side. So I think my choice that way is the loop tenotomy, hanging loop tenotomy, which you can control it on the basis of tightness of superior oblique. So you just want to remove the tightness in cases in which there is no superior oblique overaction. As Dr. Pandey was saying, some may not have any overaction of superior oblique. So that is a good procedure. Some cases may just require the sheath thinning. And nowadays the procedure is being described that you can de-sheath the superior oblique and it becomes more easily passable through the trochlea, and that's all you can do. So that is another procedure which is nowadays talked about.
Some of the tendons I think they are really very tight. You know, some of them are really tight, and some ones are not as tight. So a lot of difference in what you find on the table and what probably was clinically. This doesn't always correlate that how tight you tendon you get on the table and the FDT. I have seen a bit of variability.
Some improve with FDT alone. No, very few cases.
FDT, yeah, maybe.
Saying there is a 7th speaker. Is there a 7th speaker?
No.
No,
We
so
have
there were 3. He's not here, I think.
Okay.
Dr. Sumita Agarkar.
Doctor. So,
He was not a speaker.
anyway, she's not here. So, anything?
Dr. Pandey, you can ask me, because I would have to move to another session of ARC, the Think Under the Apple Tree, which starts at 5:25. So,
Sir, I wanted to ask one thing. Excellent presentation by all of you. I wanted to ask Dr. Shreya one thing, ma'am. Ma'am, what is your experience regarding this ocular movement restriction which is coming in mucormycosis patients? As you said, with retrobulbar amphotericin, you found improvement. Even I have been giving retrobulbar and I have also seen that, so I want to share that.
Yeah, actually, it gives very good improvement. But if we look into the scenario, when the patient comes with the orbital mucormycosis, it's really too late, because it always starts from the nostril and goes to either it goes to maxilla, palate, and then orbit. Once it is in orbit, it is definitely going to brain, as it is said. In our all three cases, what I shown here were having a already sinus surgery done. And later on, still that is the actually anger of us also, why the ENT surgeons are operating for sinus. Why can't they readily at the same time do something with the orbit? Because when all three patients came after sinus surgery and they had a little bit diplopia, confusion. So that time retrobulbar, that too lipozymal amphotericin B works very well. That worked. But initially, if you can identify it very initial stage, it works. We had two patients. Again, they didn't have any maxillary involvement, only orbital involvement. Though those patients worked very well with the amphotericin.
I'm seeing so many patients right now. We have 250 patients of mucor in my ward, and so many young patients with total ptosis and frozen globe are there.
True.
And I really wonder we won't be able to do the sling surgeries, also no Bell's phenomenon. But few of them I've seen, I'm giving retrobulbar M4 and ocular movements are improving. Ptosis is obviously not improving, but their ocular movements are definitely mild improvement is there.
That also depends on the surrounding structure is involved by mucor or the muscle itself is involved by mucor.
But I hope you are not doing exaggerations on a very liberal.
We have to do some of the cases, but not all.
My feeling is that you should avoid exaggerations. And
but how do you avoid when they are already involving the apex and cavernous sinus? And
you cannot say no, sir.
What you are, it's not going to help. You will not take out cavernous sinus, will you?
Exenteration in many of them, and some cases I have seen the other eye also has lost vision.
Yes.
Ischemic effect. I mean, even though the orbit otherwise seems to be okay, the motility is good, exenteration in one eye and the other eye is no PL.
And we have seen few cases with BRVO even.
Cavernous sinus will reach the other eye also. They are connected. So I think exenteration we are overdoing. That's my feeling. I mean, I don't know. This needs to be reflected and seen that how many actually you are saving by doing exenteration, because it's quite disfiguring surgery. So before doing disfiguring, we should have the clear-cut positive outcome which we think we will be able to get. I think there is no clarity on that.
Yeah.
Most of thermoplasty surgeons don't do exenteration by choice.
Yes.
They are doing in the expectation that doesn't happen.
Surgery to do at all. So nobody does by jumping on it. Yeah.
So I mean, there are some surgeons who are more keen to do exenteration, and that probably ends up damaging things rather benefiting. So probably you can publish your work on this retrobulbar amphotericin B. I think it is quite.
Yeah, we together will do something with Dr. Urmil Chawla. What do you say? She has already.
There are few reports on this.
Yeah.
Dr. Subhash, you'd like to say something?
Yes, sir.
Anyone? Anything? Audience? Any? There hardly any audience, I think.
Yes. All are busy with all halls.
Huh?
Too many halls.
You are hearing each other.
Yeah, Dr. Urmil, I was saying that we should do a study together and publish for amphotericin B.
Yeah, I lost my connection, ma'am. Sorry. Achha.
They have 250 cases, I think, and
yes, we have a lot many.
So, Urmil, Dr. Urmil, it is only your hospital which is referral center, or there are other centers in Haryana also?
So, sir, Haryana right now has 1,300 cases. In our institute, we are having around 250 to almost 270 ho gaye, sir, aaj. So, because all districts are referring to us, but otherwise, sir, Kanpur Medical College, then Agroha Medical College, they are also taking the cases. So, aisa nahi hai, but cases are and around 127 deaths have been reported. And in my institute, we've had 8 deaths and 16 exenteration I have done. already.
big number. And you are getting enough amphotericin B. There is
So
no
now
problem.
we are getting, initially that was an issue, but now also it's a suboptimal dose. Like we need to give 5 vials of M4 per patient. But
Yes.
right now also we are giving only 3 vials per patient.
But
That's
if
the
you are
only.
giving,
That too, we need to cover all the amphotericin B and take care of all the things before injecting.
But luckily our patients are getting it free of cost.
That's too good.
Ma'am, Haryana
Nowadays,
government is
the
giving them, that
government
is
is
why-
giving free of cost, but initially they were charging 10,000.
But the
It was
main
very
issue now
difficult.
with
No,
us
if you
is,
are not-
ma'am,
if you are
not even a
giving
single
full
patient
dosage
has been
and doing
discharged
administration,
from
that
day
is
one.
unethical.
So every day we have to take rounds of 250 patients,
Oh
and
my
that
God.
gets stopped.
I'm saying if you are not giving amphotericin B in proper dosage and doing exenteration, that
Yes,
is very unethical, I think.
Yes, that's
Sir,
true.
what to do then? What to do? You suggest, sir, what to do?
I think if you give proper amphotericin B, and
Actually-
if they are getting worse, if they are actually getting worse and deteriorating, then only you think as the rarest of rare case.
Yes, sir, we are, sir, out of 250, sir, 16 exentation, what to do, sir? They were just going into bad shape. And even few of them are still in coma. 3-4 patients are still GC poor.
Actually, before 3 months, there was a condition in our RIO, Regional Institute Ahmedabad, and my daughter's duty is there in COVID. And she said that every day they are giving 10-15 amphotericin B IV. Amphotericin B was not available outside. They were not doing exenteration. They were not removing it from sinus. They were just giving amphotericin B, and outside they need amphotericin B. It was not available. So that's the contradictory thing happens in this country.
But the literature says that we need to reduce the fungal load as much as possible.
As much as.
So we have to reduce the fungal load.
There
at
has to
least.
be evidence, then you can also chop off the neck to reduce the fungal.
No, sir, that is not the issue.
I
But
think that with that we close this session.
Thank you, sir.
Sir,
Thank you
but
a lot,
regular
Mandel sir.
supply
Thank
of
you,
N4
Priya, sir.
nowadays,
Thank you, Dr.
patients are
Elizabeth.
stable now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I
Nice.
thank all the speakers.
Thanks a lot. Best
Thank you,
wishes.
Pandey sir, for inviting. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dedia sir.
Thank
Thanks
you,
a lot.
Dr. Shia, ma'am. Thank you, Dr.
Chairperson.
Pandey, sir.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Nadia, sir.
And
Thank you.
panelists, thank you so much